You wake up and the calculations begin. Before your eyes are even fully open, your mind is sifting through yesterday, searching for what went wrong, what was misunderstood, what could have been different if you'd acted differently, said something else, planned more carefully. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from work or lack of sleep, but from constantly carrying the mental burden for everything happening around you. It's the weariness of someone who never truly rests, because they never quite feel things are under enough control to take a deep breath. You try to plan ahead, anticipate problems, prepare responses for situations that might never happen, and still, the lingering feeling is that the world insists on slipping through your fingers. A conversation takes an unexpected turn, someone else's decision derails your plans, an unforeseen event undoes weeks of preparation, and you're left there, consumed by a question you can't stop asking. Why don't things work out as they should when you're doing everything right? What's even more disturbing is that this need for control doesn't feel like a character flaw. It feels like prudence, it feels like responsibility, it feels like the rational thing to do in a world full of risks and uncertainties. After all, anyone who doesn't try to control their life is being careless, right? But Viktor Frankl, a man who literally lost everything he had built, his family, his career, his freedom, his external dignity, and survived to transform that loss into one of the most powerful philosophies of the 20th century, would have something very different to say about this. He'd say the question isn't whether you can control the world. The question is what you're losing while you try. And what Frankl discovered, in the darkest places humanity has ever created, is that the obsession with controlling what's outside of us is precisely the mechanism that robs us of the one freedom no one can ever take away. In this video, we'll explore why the impulse to control the uncontrollable not only fails inevitably, but actively destroys our capacity for genuine choice, and how Frankl's perspective offers a way out that is neither resignation nor passivity, but something far more powerful than any illusion of control. Viktor Frankl was born in Vienna in 1905, and from a young age displayed an unusual philosophical intelligence. As a teenager, he corresponded with Sigmund Freud, who even published one of his essays. But Frankl was never simply a follower of Freud or Alfred Adler, with whom he also studied. He sensed something missing from both of those major traditions. Freud saw human behavior as fundamentally driven by the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Adler saw the central motivation as the pursuit of power and superiority. To Frankl, both views captured real aspects of the human psyche, but missed the deepest element, the need for meaning. And it was only when circumstances forced him to the absolute extreme that this intuition transformed into a lived, verified understanding, not just a theory. In 1942, Frankl was deported to Theresienstadt with his wife and parents. In the following years, he passed through Auschwitz and other concentration camps. When the war ended, he had lost his wife, his parents, and his brother. The original manuscript of his first book, which he had carried hidden when arrested, was destroyed. He had, quite literally, less than nothing in a material sense. And it was precisely this context of absolute loss that made his discoveries impossible to dismiss as the comfortable theories of someone who had never tested their own ideas. Frankl wasn't theorizing about control and freedom from a university armchair. He was surviving a situation where all external control had been systematically eliminated, where guards could decide a prisoner's life or death on a whim, where the body was controlled by others in ways that don't need to be described in detail to be understood in their brutality. And it was there, in that environment where the illusion of control became literally impossible to maintain, that Frankl observed something extraordinary. He observed that even in those conditions, there was a fundamental difference between the prisoners who survived with their humanity intact and those who inwardly fractured. And that difference didn't depend on who had more physical strength, more privileges within the camp, or more luck in the selections. It depended on something internal, something the guards couldn't confiscate, no matter how hard they tried. Frankl began to articulate this as the last of human freedoms, the freedom to choose how to position oneself in the face of what happens, not the freedom to change what happens, not control over circumstances, but the capacity to decide what those circumstances would mean for your existence, how you would respond to them, what attitude you would adopt towards them. In Man's Search for Meaning, his best-known work, he wrote that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom and our growth. That simple sentence contains an entire philosophical revolution. Pause for a moment and consider what that truly means. Most of us live as if that space doesn't exist. A colleague makes a comment, and you're already on the defensive before they finish speaking. A message arrives with a tone that seems critical, and you're already constructing your reply. A plan falls apart, and you're immediately immersed in the feeling of failure. There's no discernible space between what happens and how you react. And that's precisely where the illusion of control takes root most insidiously. When we don't recognize that space, when we react automatically, we believe we are being controlled by circumstances. And to compensate for that feeling of being swept along by events, we try harder to control external circumstances. We control more. We plan more. We anticipate more. We monitor people's reactions around us more. We become more vigilant, more tense, more exhausted. And the result is always the same. The world continues to slip from our grasp because it was never controllable in that way. And we become increasingly distant from the only real freedom we possess. And now, I want to take a pause here and really talk to you. I know many of you watching this video recognize this cycle with a painful clarity. That feeling where you prepare so much, control so much, anticipate so much, and yet things slip away. And the exhaustion that comes isn't from the circumstances themselves, but from the constant effort to hold on to what cannot be held. So tell me in the comments, have you ever noticed that the more you try to control what's around you, the more you seem to lose touch with your own choices and who you truly are? If so, type here. I get lost in controlling the uncontrollable. That's all. And know that by writing this, you're giving voice to what so many others on this channel feel, but can't quite name. There's something profoundly liberating in recognizing that others carry this weight too. That this pursuit of control that exhausts us isn't your weakness, but a trap our era has built for pretty much all of us. You are not alone in this. And what comes next in this video will show you why recognizing this pattern is the first step towards something much more solid than any control you've ever tried to exert. The question Frankl posed to his patients, and now poses to us, wasn't, how can you control your life better, but rather, what is your life asking of you right now? It's a radical inversion of the usual perspective. Instead of asking what you want from life, as if life were a collection of resources at your disposal to be organized according to your will, Frankl asked what life expects of you, what this specific moment, this specific situation, this specific difficulty demands of you in terms of a response. This inversion isn't rhetorical. It represents a fundamental difference in the relationship you establish with existence. When you seek to control life, you treat circumstances as obstacles or tools. When you seek to respond to life with your best choices, you treat circumstances as opportunities to express who you are. To exercise that fundamental freedom, Frankl identified in the concentration camps. There's a core concept in Frankl's logotherapy that needs to be understood here with care. What he called the existential vacuum. Frankl observed in his clinical practice, especially after the war, a growing number of people who came to him not with neuroses in the classic Freudian sense, not with psychological conflicts generated by repressed desires or childhood traumas, but with something different and more disturbing. They arrived with a diffuse sense that life lacked sufficient meaning to justify the effort of living it. They had jobs, families, material possessions in many cases, but they felt a void that nothing they owned or achieved could fill. Frankl called this phenomenon noogenic neurosis, a disturbance that didn't come from the psychological dimension in the conventional sense, but from the noetic dimension, the specifically human dimension that seeks meaning, purpose, and values. And he noticed that this existential vacuum often manifested in two seemingly opposite ways: in passive depression, where the person stops trying, or in compulsive hyperactivity, where the person fills every moment with activity to avoid feeling the void. And the obsession with control, you see, fits perfectly into this second category. Controlling is being active, it's being busy, it's having the feeling that something is being done, that there's a response to the fundamental anxiety of not knowing what will happen next. But what Frankl precisely identified clinically is that this compulsive control doesn't resolve the vacuum. It temporarily masks it and then deepens it, because each time control fails, as it inevitably does, the vacuum reappears with even greater intensity, and the automatic response is to seek more control, to plan in greater detail, to monitor with greater vigilance. It's a self-feeding cycle. Frankl saw this pattern in variations that ranged from his Viennese patients of the 1950s to the descriptions of camp survivors who continued to obsessively control every aspect of their lives for decades after liberation, as if the terror of losing control again was more unbearable than the endless effort of trying to maintain it. What they didn't realize, and what Frankl needed to help them realize, was that the very act of over-controlling was preventing them from doing what would genuinely alleviate the vacuum, choosing how to position themselves in the face of life, with intentionality, with clear values, with a meaning that transcended the circumstances of the moment. If these ideas are resonating with something you recognize in yourself, if you realize that this pursuit of control has cost more than it has offered, I want you to know that this channel exists precisely for this journey. Here we explore Frankl's thought weekly, the discoveries of logotherapy, and the ideas of other humanist philosophers who offer real answers, not magic solutions but genuinely tested paths to transform your relationship with your own existence. If you feel you found a perspective here that finally takes seriously the depth of what you experience, click the subscribe button and become part of this community. You're not alone in this quest, and the journey becomes much richer when traveled with others who also refuse to accept superficial answers to profound questions. Frankl developed a therapeutic technique that perfectly illustrates the difference between controlling and choosing. He called it paradoxical intention, and it worked in a way that seemed completely counterintuitive. A patient with severe insomnia, for example, who spent their nights trying to force sleep with all their might, concentrating on the act of falling asleep, monitoring their own state of wakefulness with growing anxiety, was trapped in a cycle where the effort to control sleep was precisely what prevented sleep. Frankl instructed this patient to actively try not to sleep, to want to stay awake. And paradoxically, by abandoning the forced control over their sleep state, many patients were finally able to relax enough to fall asleep. But paradoxical intention went far beyond relaxation tricks. It was a practical demonstration that human will, when applied to the wrong thing, turns against itself. You cannot force pleasure, you cannot command love, you cannot demand creativity, and you cannot control sleep in the same way you control the movement of a hand. These dimensions of human experience require a different quality of presence, something closer to openness than to control. The same logic applies on an existential scale. When you try to control how people think of you, you're applying your will to the wrong thing. When you try to control the outcomes of your actions far beyond your reasonable influence, you're wasting energy that could be directed toward the quality of the actions themselves. When you try to control the future through anticipatory anxiety, you're living in a time that doesn't exist at the expense of the only real time you have. And crucially, when you spend mental and emotional resources trying to control the uncontrollable, you have less of those energies available to exercise the only form of control that is genuinely yours. The choice of how to respond to what happens, the choice of what values you'll express through your actions, the choice of the meaning you'll assign to your experiences. Frankl described three main avenues through which humans can find meaning, and each reveals something important about the distinction between controlling and choosing. The first avenue is what he called creative values, meaning the significance found in the act of creating something, of contributing something to the world. This doesn't necessarily mean grand artistic works or scientific discoveries. It could be the care you put into a conversation with someone who is suffering, the thoughtfulness you put into a task no one will see, the quality of presence you bring to those who depend on you. The meaning here doesn't come from a controlled outcome, it comes from the quality of the delivery. An artisan who works with precision and love doesn't control whether their work will be admired. They control the quality of their attention and dedication in the process, and it's in that choice of attention and dedication that meaning resides, regardless of the outcome. The second avenue is what Frankl called experiential values, the meaning found in the act of receiving what the world and people have to offer, of letting yourself be touched by beauty, by kindness, by love. And here, the trap of control becomes even more visible. A person obsessed with control has difficulty genuinely receiving. When someone offers them affection, they're evaluating if it's genuine. When they're faced with something beautiful, they're thinking about how to preserve or reproduce that experience. When someone close shares something vulnerable, they're processing how to respond correctly, instead of simply being present. Control demands constant management. Genuine experience demands surrender. And Frankl saw, in the concentration camps, that even in moments of greatest horror, there were prisoners who could open themselves to a phrase exchanged with a fellow inmate, to the light filtering through a crack, to a distant melody. And that this capacity to be touched by the real, however minimal, was itself a form of existential resistance, an affirmation that the human dimension had not been completely extinguished. The third avenue, and perhaps the most powerful from Frankl's perspective, is what he called attitudinal values. The meaning found in the stance we adopt in the face of suffering we cannot avoid. This avenue is particularly relevant here because it represents the most radical transformation of the idea of control. It's not resignation, it's not passivity, it's the realization that when circumstances are truly uncontrollable, when illness advances, when loss occurs, when injustice cannot be reversed, there still exists an intact dimension of freedom. The dimension of how you will position yourself in relation to it. Frankl observed prisoners who maintained their human dignity even when all external dignity had been systematically removed. He observed people who continued to help others even when they had almost nothing to offer. He observed the difference between someone who lost their humanity in the face of dehumanization and someone who, through an act of deep inner choice, refused to let external circumstances define their internal identity. And that difference, for Frankl, wasn't a matter of innate character or psychological luck. It was a matter of existential exercise, of a faculty that can be cultivated, developed, and strengthened. What does this mean for us, living lives that, while difficult, don't compare to concentration camps? It means that most of us have access to vastly more freedom than Frankl and his fellow inmates possessed, and that we're using a fraction of that freedom because we spend most of our energy trying to control what is outside of us. Every time you spend hours compulsively rereading an email you've already sent, hoping to reverse its impact, you're using energy from your only real freedom on something that can no longer be altered. Every time you try to control how someone will perceive you by performing a version of yourself instead of simply being, you're trading authenticity, which is a value you can exercise, for approval, which is a circumstance you cannot control. Every time you delay a decision, waiting to gather more certainty about the future, you're putting your freedom of choice on hold, while time, which is definitely not under your control, marches on. Frankl developed the concept of self-distancing to describe a uniquely human capacity that is directly relevant here. Other animals are completely immersed in their impulses and reactions. A frightened dog bites or flees, with no space between the fear and the action. But humans have the capacity to distance themselves from their own processes, to observe their impulses without being automatically governed by them, to recognize, I am feeling the impulse to control this, before simply acting on that impulse. This self-distancing is the prerequisite for the freedom of choice Frankl described. Without it, we continue to react, believing we are choosing but actually being governed by the same automatic patterns as always. With it, the space between stimulus and response becomes perceptible and habitable, and in that space, it becomes possible to ask, what do I genuinely choose here? What aligns with what I value? What expresses who I want to be, not who fear is pushing me to be? The concept that complements self-distancing is what Frankl called self-transcendence, and this is perhaps the most radical aspect of his thinking. He observed that human beings function best, find more meaning and more genuine happiness, not when they are focused on themselves, on their own happiness, their own problems, their own security, but when they are directed towards something beyond themselves, towards a purpose that serves others, towards a cause that matters, towards a relationship with another person that is valued for its own sake. Happiness, for Frankl, is a byproduct that appears when you are engaged with something that transcends your own ego, not a goal that can be pursued directly. And compulsive control is, at its core, a contraction towards the self, an attempt to make the world small enough to be managed. Self-transcendence is the opposite movement, an expansion towards what is beyond you, accepting that the world is larger than any plan you might make about it, and that it is precisely in this grandeur that the most significant possibilities reside. There's a natural objection that arises here, and it deserves to be taken seriously. You might say, but Frankl also values responsibility, and responsibility implies some form of control over one's own actions. That's true, and the distinction needs to be made carefully. Frankl was deeply committed to existential responsibility. He wasn't preaching a fatalistic passivity, where nothing we do matters because we can't control the outcomes. On the contrary, he saw responsibility as inseparable from freedom. We are responsible precisely because we are free to choose. But responsibility, in the Franklian perspective, isn't about controlling outcomes. It's about being true to the choices that are genuinely within our power. The quality of our attention, the honesty of our actions, the integrity of our values, the way we respond to what we cannot avoid. A doctor can't control whether their patient will survive, but they are fully responsible for the quality of their care, for the rigor of their judgment, for the compassion of their presence. This responsibility doesn't require control of the uncontrollable. It requires clear choices about what is within one's actual domain. Frankl developed this distinction from his own experience in a visceral way. In the camps, he couldn't control when he would be selected, whether he'd receive enough food, whether he'd survive the next day. But he could choose whether to save his last piece of bread for himself or share it with someone weaker. He could choose whether to treat a dying fellow inmate with human presence or look away. He could choose in his mind to keep imagining reuniting with his wife, to keep developing the ideas he one day wanted to publish, to keep being the doctor he had decided to be, even when all medical practice had been taken away from him. These choices didn't alter the external circumstances, but they constituted an inner existence that the totalitarian system, for all its brutality, couldn't touch. And for Frankl, this distinction wasn't a philosophical consolation. It was the real, clinically observed difference between people who maintained the will to survive and those who gave up, between those who came out of the camps with their humanity intact and those who emerged fragmented, between those who found a path back to life and those who remained trapped in meaningless trauma. What happens when you begin to practice this distinction in your own life, separating what is genuinely in your domain of choice from what is not? Frankl saw this as a gradual process, not an instantaneous transformation. It begins with the ability to notice, in the moment the urge to control arises, that there's a question that precedes action. Is this really in my domain, or am I about to expend energy trying to control the uncontrollable? And then comes a deeper question. If I accept that this aspect is not within my control, what is the choice I genuinely have here? What can I do that aligns with what I value, regardless of the outcome? This practice, repeated over time, will gradually shift the center of gravity of your life, from the external to the internal. Not in the sense of narcissistic introspection, but in the sense of anchoring your identity and your sense of worth, not in the outcomes you manage to control, but in the values you choose to express. And paradoxically, when you stop expending energy trying to control the uncontrollable and begin directing that energy towards the choices that genuinely belong to you, you often become more effective at what you can actually influence, because the attention that was spread across 1,000 worries about possible outcomes concentrates on the quality of what you are doing now, because the energy that was being consumed by anxious vigilance is freed up for active presence, because the people around you sense the difference between someone who is trying to control the outcome of every interaction and someone who is genuinely present with them, and they respond completely differently to these two presences. Frankl wasn't a naive optimist. He knew from direct experience that terrible things happen regardless of how well you choose. But he also knew from that same direct experience that the quality of the choices we make within the circumstances we do not choose is what ultimately constitutes a human life, and that this quality is available to us in every moment, regardless of what is happening around us. If you've made it this far in this video, if these ideas are resonating with something you needed to hear, please hit that like button so more people can find this perspective. The YouTube algorithm needs a signal that this content is worth distributing, and every like is a concrete way to help others who are on this same quest find this space for reflection. And if you're not yet subscribed to this channel, now is the time. Not because you have to, but because if you recognize in yourself that weight of trying to control what can't be controlled, if you feel the exhaustion of a freedom that isn't being fully exercised, you deserve to have ongoing access to philosophical tools that are both profound and practical. Here every week, we explore the thinking of Frankl and others who have dedicated their lives to understanding what makes human existence genuinely livable, not just bearable. Let's go back to the moment we started with, that weight you wake up with, that feeling that the day has already started slipping out of your control. What Frankl offers us isn't a technique to manage the day better. It's a more honest understanding of what the day truly is, a sequence of moments where you don't choose what shows up, but you continuously choose how you position yourself in relation to what shows up. And that position, that inner compass of who you decide to be regardless of circumstances, is a form of freedom that no one created for you and no one can take from you. The question Frankl leaves us with, the question that becomes urgent when we stop trying to control the uncontrollable, isn't how will I make the world work the way it needs to, but rather, who am I choosing to be while the world does what it always does? This simple question, brought into our daily lives, into difficult conversations, into plans that fall apart, into relationships that disappoint, into those moments when the urge to control surges with all its might. This question is the most demanding and most liberating philosophical exercise Frankl bequeathed to us. And the answer, unlike control, is entirely in your hands.